Hello and welcome to this lecture on indices of biological integrity. This lecture is part of a stream ecology course offered at SMCM during the summer of 2020. So a lot to cover, and in fact I've changed the title of this slide numerous times now, but ultimately what we are going to try to do is understand something about our environment by looking at the animals that live within it. So as we've already talked about in this course, certainly we want to understand the environment we live in. And to do that, we need to make some measure. Right? You look at this stream and you say it's degraded. But how degraded? Relative to what? What was the starting point? Right? We need to ask a lot of questions. Maybe you could say, I'm going to make an index, which is a stream is degraded based on the number of tires I can find within a reach of a stream in 10 minutes. Okay, and here you would find probably a fair number of tires, right? But maybe tires aren't that common, or maybe those are not a great way to detect streams that aren't very badly degraded. So ultimately what we want to do is have a tool that lets us go into a site and say, this is a system. It is at this level of degradation or this level of change. And if we want to modify it, we'll push it in this direction, or it's going, if we don't do anything, it's going to tend to go in this direction. Or if we maintain business as usual and we come back and we say, oh, look, it's exactly the same as it was when we were here before, then we have good indication that things are relatively stable, that whatever degradation has already occurred, and now the system operates in that new way. One of the important things that we need to then consider is the world without us in it, right? This is a conceptual model that we're trying to build out now. And if we're going to say that the thing is degraded or changed from the starting point, we would need then to know what the starting point is. And ideally, we would be able to compare that with a system where there are no humans, right? So we take this system and we compare it to this system over here where there are humans. I've already talked about this in the actual discussion elements of this course, but there is no such system in the world. Humans are now such an important force on the surface of the earth that there is no system in the world that has not been modified by humans. So we can't test this directly, right? And instead what we're going to need to do is find some other metric that will allow us to convert something we see with our eyes and a feeling about a place, right, into some quantifiable metric to say if that feeling is actually useful. Yeah, this is degraded. The system is in trouble. Or, you know what? This system is not degraded. This system is functioning very much as it has prior to human intervention here. One thing that comes into play now too is something about the political and social sphere that we have for a while left to the back burner, but I think now is an important time to start to bring it forward. We have this environment, and many of us might say, oh, I'd really like that stream to be X, or I'd really like it to function like Y. Right? Oh, okay, let's protect it. But anyone who's ever worked in stream restoration will tell you that restoration is expensive. And so there's a cost associated with that. And not just a direct cost of let's make it different than it is, but oftentimes there's an opportunity cost. By not exploiting the stream, by not dumping waste directly into the stream, for instance, I have to pay to either maybe have a less efficient factory, or I have to pay to substantially increase piping to that area so I can remove the waste from that region, right? So there's real costs associated with this. In addition to that, there's social elements here that are appearing, right? Now we have to deal not just with can we grow the economy or not, but there are often social importance associated with areas. Sometimes we look at a stream and someone says, I want to protect that stream, almost independent of the cost, right? And that's not because they necessarily harvest anything from it, or they collect a resource from it, or they use it to transport materials away, but because they have some social relationship or some social element that sits in importance within that stream context, and they have to have that stream to associate those together. So for instance, I think that we could, if we spend enough money, divert the Mississippi. Right? Imagine this, we could divert the Mississippi. But I suspect that many Americans would find it offensive that we had taken what we have called the mother of all rivers and modified it, a quintessential American river. In a more tangible sense, the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon at one point was slated to be dammed and filled, and there would not be a Grand Canyon today. In fact, if that procedure had gone forward. And it became very, very close to actually happening. But at the last moment, people got really offended by the thought that some iconic U.S. landmark would be eliminated. And it did have nothing to do with the fact that people thought that they were going to necessarily visit it or that they thought they were going to extract more resources from it. And it had everything to do with the social understanding that they wanted it protected because it had something to do with their identity. This makes us who we are to a degree. One thing that will then therefore come up frequently is something like this. An environmental regulation will require money, and that there is therefore this competition between often what we think of as people and businesses. Now, there is a degree of this which is true, that protecting the environment is costly. Sometimes this gets framed as the government versus people, right? The government is enforcing these regulations. Regulations put restraints on business. Business therefore cannot hire as many individuals, and so the government is indirectly coming in and removing resources from a community. I'm going to hopefully argue that that actually is not necessarily the case, and that sort of counterintuitively, regulation can actually generate value. And if you're in the restoration community, then you will know this because you're a business that's entirely in existence because of a government regulation requiring us to do restoration. And so that is generating a new type of business. So for instance, the Clean Air Act, which requires us to maintain the air quality in the United States, was reviewed, right? So here you go, this Clean Air Act is reviewed. I would point out that it extends into 2020. The reason for that, even though this was March 2011, is because they can do forecast modeling. So these benefits are also based on what they expect to see in the future as well, which makes sense. It would make the most sense to say in the recent time period, what are the benefits going to be? And you can see that actually by cleaning up the air, by forcing us to clean up the air, we got a 30-to-1 benefit, which means that for every dollar we spent on cleaning up the air, we saw $30 of return. How does that happen? Well, for instance, by cleaning up the air, we had less people calling out sick because people had fewer cases of sickness. We had fewer visits to hospitals, especially for people that had asthma, so that cost less for the system to operate under. We had businesses that made money off of cleaning up the air, right? That actually produced materials that would help do that or provided support for other businesses that needed to do those kind of things. So just because we mandate cleanliness, we mandate modifications, does not necessarily mean that we always lose, right? There can be real and very obvious tangible benefits. Now let's compare that to another important act in the United States, the Clean Water Act, which does similar things to the Clean Air Act, maintains and requires within them the proper maintenance of our nation's waterways. And if you do any research on this, what you'll find is that, in fact, the Clean Water Act has been very expensive and has produced very little net benefit per cost. So if you think about this, another way of saying that is for every dollar spent, right, on the Clean Water Act, we got 37 cents back of improvement. That seems to suggest that things like the Clean Water Act are large failures, right? That you can maybe have a situation that we were concerned about before, the government stepping in, maintaining some arbitrary standard that is extremely difficult to reach and ultimately just costs businesses huge amounts of money. But I would like to point out, and the authors point this out, that there are a number of questions often that are associated with actually measuring this. So in a first glance, a 0.37 return is cruddy, but we have not done a good job many times of categorizing how the benefit is accounted for. And so many of the benefits may not be taken into account. So that jury is maybe still out on the Clean Water Act, but I would point out that there is room for improvement. So in the sense, which is right? Government is wasteful and environmental regulations are damaging, or environmental regulations are always helpful? The answer is it might be a little bit of both, and it may require a lot of work on sections that are not working to make it work effectively. But in some cases, we are doing a really good job, and we could probably get even more out of it, for instance, with the Clean Air Act, by doing even a little bit more. So one thing that both of these acts require is that we protect environments. And one of the things that the Clean Water Act is very concerned with is what enters our waterways. And an issue related to that is that what enters our waterways is partially dependent on what we put in the watershed. So for instance, if you're building a development and you buy some land and you say, I would like to build small apartment complexes or split homes to house a couple of families. And this is what I'd like. I'd like to expand the parking and the driveways to allow them to have access with their vehicles. And maybe I'd also like to put in a small storage unit, and I'll need to run more cables through the neighborhood because I'm going to need more power, maybe some internet lines. I'd also like to put in more piping for the various houses because the original piping that was at the site is old or won't be sufficient for the number of homes I expect. And when you present that to me, I'll say, great, that's a fine idea, right? But it doesn't automatically, you're not allowed to just start to automatically break ground. And one of the things that you may be asked to do is determine if you're going to have an impact on a local stream and figure out later if you have had that impact, right? So how do you do that? Well, you'll go send people out into the stream, right? All right, just go out in the stream and do your thing, right? Well, what is it that you're going to ask them to do, right? If money is on the line here, if we're worried about how much it's going to cost, I want it to be efficient. I want it to be a very clear and precise answer. And I want to know very rapidly after having done the survey or whatever it is that I'm going to do, what that outcome is. It's not going to help me if you say, yeah, we can do a survey. Now, it'll take at least a couple of years for us to work up all the data. But in, I would say, no more than 5 to 10 years' time, we can tell you if you need to do mitigation. Right, that's not what you want. You want to say, yeah, we'll go out and do the survey and we'll be able to tell you within a month what's happening, right? Between doing the survey and going through the data and telling you if you need to change anything, right? A couple of weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, you can see results. Great. So how do you do that? Well, the Act, one of the things that the Clean Water Act requires of us is to restore and maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. One of the most important elements that the Clean Water Act attempts to do is to maintain integrity of biological systems. So in a sense, what it is allowing you to sue over or to argue about is that there needs to be a maintenance of quality. And that is really important. But how do we demonstrate that there is a maintenance of quality? Now, again, I want to point this out. To understand the world that we live in, we're going to have to boil it down to some numerical value. We've got to be able to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. We can't go about saying this stream is degraded. In what way? How is that then measured? How do we know how much we're supposed to do until it's not degraded? Right? So we need to break this down into some sort of numerical value. What we can actually do is make what's called an index. This is the same kind of thing that people use all the time, whether they're aware of it or not, and it's just a numerical number placed on something in the environment, right? And we'll measure it and then report back on whether that's increasing or decreasing or staying the same. What could we use in this image that we could use as an index to say, okay, the stream is either being maintained or that it's falling below the standards that we've set for it? A good example of one that people are very familiar hearing, whether they understand it's an index or not, is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The Dow Jones is not a company, right? It's not the economy. It is an amalgamation of various companies considered important, right? These were hand selected to be on the Dow Jones, so it's by definition biased in favor of these companies. And they are supposed to be bellwethers of the general economic climate, right? So that having these will be a broad different grouping of different companies. But the Dow Jones is not the economy. So the Dow Jones can go up, right? It could go up quite a bit. And that would not mean that the average person is experiencing, let's say, a higher paycheck. What it would mean is that those companies that were being used for the index at that moment were expected to have higher earnings in the future based on current investor sentiment, right? Which is a long way of saying that it's a number trying to estimate what things are going to be like in the near future. And that is an important thing to remember, that it is not in and of itself anything. It's a made-up value that is useful at gauging some temperature. So how do the bugs play into this? And how do we go about using bugs? Well, if you're going to use, in this case when I say bugs, I mean insects and macroinverts in general probably, maybe you can use some measure of the bugs in the system to understand the quality of the system. Right, so there's something like this. We're going to get away with using, instead of spiders in this case, which we're not going to deal with, we're going to get away with measuring something directly from the bugs themselves. Now, if you remember back to that aquatic macroinvertebrate life cycle, I said that a lot of insects have complicated life cycles, and many of them have something like this, where there's eggs that produce a larvae, and the larvae emerges and becomes an adult. Some of them go through a pupal stage, but many of them have these complex lives where they're in an aquatic system and then they're in a terrestrial system. That requires multiple types of habitat. They also live for multiple years frequently, so they're going to require some stability between those habitats. And there's all this interplay between the habitat and the organism. So even a simplified system still contains in it a fairly complex view of the world. And so the insect is a really good way maybe to measure something about streams because it touches on a lot of pieces of the stream in general, right? It touches on a lot of different needed parts that we expect are going to have large ramifications for other organisms in the system as well. So how might we go about using the bugs then to tell us something, to make an index? Well, first what we do is want to establish an undisturbed community. And again, I already said that this doesn't really exist, but what we can do is get pretty close to it, right? Maybe we go into natural areas that haven't been disturbed for a long time, or maybe we go to areas that have been protected for a long time, right? And we can find something very close to that, or as close as we can get, and use that as our starting point. And then we can compare it to all other streams that would have looked like that. And after we go into those streams, we'll measure the community in some way, right? This index we're going to generate, we're going to measure the community, and preferably we're going to do this over different time periods. We're not just going to go in once, we're going to do it a lot of times over a longer time horizon. We'll go into the systems that we don't know, and then we're going to compare it back to that sort of idealized version of a system. And once we do that, we can start to actually identify individual stressors because certain species will drop out in response to different stressors. And after all that, maybe we'll get into recommendations for remediation and mitigation. And ultimately, that may lead to the production of a remediation or mitigation plan and execution of that plan. So expectation is something like this. The richness of macroinvertebrates in a community will decline, let's assume somewhat linearly, with the amount of modification of that habitat from its initial starting point. Now there's going to be a lot of variability around this. Why would we expect this to be the case? Well, as budding stream ecologists, you know that many of the systems that are in place in the stream are going to be heavily modified by humans, right? We're going to change a lot of things about how the stream actually operates. And so as those systems are lost, we're going to get a simplified system. And a simplified system is going to produce a simplified group of organisms that exploit that system. One other thing that we should be considering while we think about that is why won't this work? Why could it fail, right? Well, there's many reasons why this might fail. What I've expressed to you is something about a general pattern that we see. but there are many ways in which a general pattern will not hold up. You might go to a very pristine looking stream that may have just been cleared out by a large flood event, and there's very few species in it. And if you were to place that into your model, right, you'll have very few species in that stream, and you'll say, well, the base condition is there are very few species in the stream in general. And then you'll go into an urban center and say, see, we didn't lose any, things look fine, right? That's one way it could fail. There are others as well, and I would suggest that you spend a little bit of time thinking about how they may fail, and this is certainly something people do because they want to understand why it's not working, or why it may not work as expected, or what are the weaknesses of this approach. Another thing, sort of a subheading underneath why this might not work, is why is there so much variability? Why isn't this a nice straight line? Why are there points all over the place? Now, we've already shown that one of the things that we don't like about aquatic macroinverts is that they're so diverse. And so instead of thinking about them as maybe a species, sometimes we think about them as a group. Sometimes we think about them as health indicators. Maybe there are some that are high quality health indicators and some that are low quality health indicators, right? So maybe you could group these now instead of by feeding, but by sensitivity. So maybe you'll have species that aren't sensitive, species that are sensitive, and something in between as well, right? So you could use some of that taxonomic information, and you might be able to avoid going too far down, right? Like if you could identify to some point in every species that followed after that point is a group that is highly resistant to change, you could stop IDing and just classify that as a very tolerant species, right? And so there's ways to avoid going too far down the list. If you look at this image on the right, you see a bunch here, right? So the greens here are ones that are very sensitive species, and the blue ones are extremely sensitive species, right? And so you could break this up into different groups. Maybe you don't have this much data. Maybe you just have tolerant and intolerant, right? So you only have two categories. There's a lot of ways you can do this, but you can also expect that if you go into the literature, you can find a list of these species that are intolerant, species that are very tolerant, species that are in between that, right? And you won't necessarily have to build that database. You can just find it somewhere and use it. So bugs are certainly a way to do this. I've mentioned those now, but why didn't I mention fish, right? They're in streams too, right? And we talked a lot about fish, and we know a lot about fish, and people like fish. So I've only talked about using them as part of an IBI, an index of biological integrity. It's an index of biological integrity, not insect integrity, right? And presumably, when you're thinking about preservation and maintenance of a stream, one of the really important things that you might be concerned about is fishability. And you can do it, it turns out. So this is an IBI built from fish. And you can see that there appears to be a relationship, right? That there is some relationship there. So why isn't this just universally done? Well, keep in mind this relationship again. There are relatively few large animals in a system. And you know that because of the second law of thermodynamics, which says there's not 100% efficient energy transfer. So the large organisms are going to be rare relative to small organisms because it takes a lot of small organisms to make one big organism. And again, you already know this. We already covered this in the lecture. Some of these are materials from the same slides, right? So I'm not going to spend a long time on these, but I just want to point out that you already have a good explanation. The reason that we might not use fish is they're rarer. There aren't as many of them. They are not as diverse as macroinvertebrates, so they are not going to show you as many different types of stressors as macroinverts are because they are rarer on the landscape by the very nature of them. Another important element about fish is because they need to eat a lot, right? Many fish are really migratory, and so they may move across a huge number of ecosystems. And so sometimes when you look at a fish, you may not be getting very much information about the stream that you're in, but you may be getting information about the streams that it moves around in, which may not be very helpful to you. So let's summarize some of the advantages, though, that IBIs in general provide, right? It doesn't mean you can't use fish, but the macroinverts are the predominant tool. But maybe, as you can see on this right picture, you could use a bunch of different IBIs. Maybe use habitat, algae, invertebrates, and fish, right? And then you could generate a composite score. Okay, so For instance, this first river here has a score of 13. That's an index. It's just a value associated with this stream. Now, if that score after you did development fell to 11, then I could say, hey, you have to mitigate until you get that number back up to 13, right? It's not that when you go out to the stream, there's a 13 printed at the bottom of the stream. You're like, oh yeah, this is a 13 stream. Classic. Classic for this region. It's that it's related based on these other features, right? So what are some of the broad advantages IBIs offer? They're easy to standardize to a degree. I know that people who work on this will probably roll their eyes at me and be like, oh, brother. But they are at least standard. They can be standardized across large areas, right? And so there is the illusion that they're very, very easy to standardize. They can be standardized. Macroinverts are everywhere if you're going to rely on that, and reliance on macroinverts is the most common way to do this. Fish are often very common as well, so they can be useful. In any case, biology, I should say, is everywhere. So you will find some biological phenomena to study. For macroinverts especially, there's a large number of species. If you go into algae or other organisms, you can also potentially find very large numbers of species as well. So there's potentials to use those. For many groups, there isn't as much movement out of or movement around the water, right? So indeed, we've talked about the drift paradox for macroinverts, but it turns out that most individuals stay in the area they come from. It's just those few rare individuals that are important. One of the real big advantages for a macroinvert is that the life cycle is just long enough to detect changes without being so long that it's hard to know which change they're detecting, right? So if you have a fish that lives 15 years, it being wiped out in year 7, and then you go back to the stream at year 15 and it's still not there, right? Well, that's not surprising. It takes a long time for these populations to recover. But have you mitigated the impact you have? You very well may have, but how are you going to detect that? Whereas macroinverts are on the order of a year to 2 to 3 years at most, frequently for a life cycle. So you'll get really good information about their response because either they will return very quickly or they won't. And if they don't return, then you have really good indication that, hey, this system is still not up to par, or hey, this system is still modified. It's not supporting these other guys. For macroinverts and a lot of these other things, the cost to sample is pretty low. Even if you want to sample fish, sampling for fish is not that expensive. It can be done with just a few people, and you can do large stretches. So cost to sample is relatively low for IBIs. For all of these groups, the I should say, except for algae, which may be variable, the taxonomy for fishes and inverts is well known. So depending on how much information you want to extract, you can go as far as you want. And for inverts and fish, we have known responses by individuals. So we know what factors drive the predominance of one group over another. And so we don't have to build out that knowledge. You can say, well, this fish is here. That's characteristic of a habitat that is switching from cool water to warm water. Or that's characteristic for these inverts of switching from ground-fed to surface-fed streams, right? So very useful information can be gleaned from that. A lot of reasons why IBIs could be attractive. There are disadvantages of this approach, though, as I already talked about earlier. The response to some stressors may not be detectable. Okay, so if your organisms, whatever you pick, right, you may not pick everything. You may pick a subset of organisms, don't respond to some stressor, you won't be able to detect it. The distribution is affected by the environment too, so you have to be thoughtful about this. Like if you go out to a really pristine site and then there's a hurricane, things are going to change, and okay, well, we'll sample it at a different time. Fine, you can sample it at a different time, but imagine that you're in a business and you're trying to mitigate your effects on a stream. If I tell you, hey, next year is shot because we just had this big hurricane come through and I can't really sample and give you useful information, right? Having to delay for a year of work because your sampling isn't going to be effective is a pretty uncomfortable situation to be in, right? You're also betting on the fact that you're not going to have a large-scale environmental disturbance again, natural disturbance again, that would prevent you from doing it for another year. And those kind of things can be costly. Seasonal variability is real. So if you say to me, I'd like you to go out in July and sample this, and I say, well, the vast majority of our database is from May. I'd recommend that we do this in May or not at all. You might say, well, I can't get you in May. That's not going to happen. You got to go out in July. Well, if you go out in July, I'm just warning you, our database is really a May-focused database. I may not be able to compare these very easily, right? It really is starting to look like apples to oranges again. And of course, regardless of what you do, there are certain types of analyses which will be expensive. If you want me to get down into fairly low taxonomic levels, yeah, it's going to be expensive. If you want me to do certain measures, let's say you want the mercury concentration in fish as part of your index, right? If all your fish come back as low mercury, that gets put into your index as a 1. If they all come back as high mercury, that goes in as a 0. And they can fall anywhere in between that. Well, if you're going to do, one fish, all right, but if you're going to do 100 fish, and that's starting to get kind of expensive. We have to collect all these different fish, right? So there can be elements of this that can be quite expensive. And no matter what you do with an IBI, it's always indirect. You're not measuring the effect directly. You're measuring the response of the biota to that effect. So there's always that possibility that you're misinterpreting it. Regardless of whether you think this is a good idea or not, the state of Maryland is very invested in this. So it doesn't matter in one sense your view on it. The state has made a decision that this is an important tool that they are going to use. I generally agree with them. I think it's a very useful tool. I think that it's a very easy way to collect lots of data that can be broadly useful. And what you can see here is that these data are widely available, and we'll use some of these. In fact, by the time you watch this lecture, you may have already had a chance to play around with some of those data. I've been talking about species diversity, right? And diversity is just the number of species in the environment. But you could think of ways in which species diversity would be unfair or an inappropriate way to go about measuring something in the environment, right? This is an index. We're generating a value. So we could think of other ways that species diversity may fail us. And here's a great example of that. Both of these communities have the same species diversity. Community A, I know that these are mushrooms. This is the best figure I could find for this. Community A has exactly the same number of species as community B. But community B is clearly a more diverse community and is more likely to sustain changes in that system because there's a lot more members. Community A is far more likely, if just a couple members die, you may lose a whole species out of that. So we'd probably want to see more like community B, which tends to look more resilient. So maybe if we just say species richness in our metric, in our index, is not a sufficient tool. Maybe we want to talk about something else. Right? We want to incorporate abundance relative to that, and that's called species evenness. There's a bunch of ways to go about doing this. One, the Shannon's diversity, there's species evenness, Simpson's index, Jacquard's index. All of these are indices that the individuals have built. This is Shannon here on the right. And that are attempts to provide more nuance to this tool, right? That provide a better understanding of what you're actually seeing out there. And I want to expose this to you not because I necessarily need you to know all these, but because I want you to appreciate that there's lots of ways in which you can start to think about incorporating all this data you're collecting into a more holistic picture that is more sensitive, right? If we're going to collect tons of data, let's get a great sensitive metric out of it and not a cruddy insensitive metric. And Shannon is interesting because he was also actually involved with this, which is the U.S. Navy in World War II. One of the things that he was important with was figuring out how to calculate how to get the shells from those guns onto targets. And he was also really important at finding submarines and cryptography and breaking German U-boat codes during the war. So there's hope for us yet. Aquatic macroinvertebrates aren't the only thing in life. Maybe you can get involved in big changes too. All right, so the next lecture that will be in this series will be human pressures other than climate change. So we'll discuss some of the ways that humans modify streams.